The twin suns of Tirakai burned low in the sky. Their dying light splintered across the jagged towers of the citadel. The air shimmered with heat and tension. Drums thundered from colossal bone pipes embedded into the arena walls, each strike echoing through the stone like a war cry. At the heart of this vast amphitheater stood Kale, a lone human stripped of weapons, his wrists raw from old shackles. Dust coated his bare shoulders, but his eyes were hard, steady. Every scar on his body told a story of survival, each mark a refusal to break. Around him, tier after tier of Tirakai warriors howled for his death, their voices like a storm tearing through the air. Facing him was their chosen champion, Risa Vale, daughter of the warlord. She was young, but the arena whispered her name, like legend. Her armor gleamed obsidian, her scaled skin caught the sun's light, and in her grip rested a weapon carved from black stone and etched with living fire. The blade pulsed with runes that crawled like molten veins. To the Tirakai, it wasn't simply a sword. It was a relic tied to their blood and their gods. Kyle had no such relic, no armor, no promise of rescue. Just his battered fists and the will to stand tall before a people who had spent years trying to grind him down. The warlord himself watched from a throne carved into the upper wall, his golden eyes unblinking. Beside him, elders leaned forward, robes trailing dust, eager for the human's humiliation. To them, Kale's death would prove the Tirakai's dominance once more. The gong struck. The duel began. Risa moved first, circling him like a predator, testing prey. Her voice, low and sharp, carried across the sands. "You are no warrior. You are nothing." Kale didn't answer. He didn't need to. He let her words pass through him, waiting for the inevitable lunge. It came fast, faster than he expected. The rune blade slashed down, trailing fire through. The air. Kyle barely sidestepped, sand exploding where the strike landed. He grabbed her wrist, trying to twist her momentum away, but she was strong, her body honed from endless drills and battles. With a sudden turn, she broke free and whipped the blade across his open palm. Pain exploded in his hand. The cut was shallow, but it burned like acid. He staggered, teeth clenched against the fire, searing through his nerves. He expected blood to drip into the sand, nothing more. Instead, the blade shrieked. The runes along its length flared brighter, pulsing as if they had tasted something forbidden. The light leapt from the weapon into his wound. Symbols danced across his skin, racing along his veins, carving themselves into his flesh with fire. He dropped to one knee, clutching his hand. But before he could grasp what was happening, a wave of energy rippled outward. It was like a silent thunderclap. The arena shook. Dust spiraled. The Tirakai roared in confusion. Then the roaring stopped. One by one, warriors fell to their knees. Entire rows of armored soldiers bowed their heads, spines pressed into the dirt. Even the fiercest gladiators collapsed as if a giant hand had crushed them. Risa froze mid-swing. Her eyes widened as the sword trembled in her grip, the runes no longer hers to command. She looked at Kale as though he had become something alien, something impossible. He lifted his gaze, breathing hard, staring at the glowing mark spreading across his palm. The wound wasn't closing. It was transforming. The symbols etched into him burned with the same light that crawled along her sword. He hadn't just bled. He had triggered something deep within their most sacred relic. The crowd, thousands, strong, went silent. The sound of knees striking stone replaced their cheers. Even the elders leaned back, faces drained of color. Risa whispered the words like a curse. The covenant in human flesh. Kyle didn't understand. Not yet. All he knew was that he was still alive, his enemy frozen, and the entire arena was bent before him. The runes had chosen him. For the first time since his capture, the human wasn't the prisoner in the sand. He was the center of every gaze, every fear, every bowing warrior, and he didn't even know why. The arena still trembled. Dust hung in the air like smoke after a battle, and every Tirakai remained bowed, foreheads pressed into the dirt, unable to rise. Kale's hand still burned with light, the alien symbols curling and locking themselves into his skin as if they had always belonged there. He flexed his fingers. Pain flared, but beneath it was something stranger. Power, raw and alive, surging through his veins like fire tethered to his heartbeat. Rissa Vale stumbled backward, her blade shaking as if it wanted to leap from her grip. The runes that once obeyed her now pulsed in rhythm with Kale's wound. She stared at him, horror etched on her face. "That's not possible. You can't. Your kind can't." Her words broke off, strangled by disbelief. An elder, bent, with age but eyes bright with fear, pushed through the kneeling crowd and shuffled forward. He collapsed to his knees before Kyle, bowing so low his forehead cracked against stone. His voice trembled. "The blood mark has awakened in the unworthy. The covenant has recognized him." Kyle's jaw clenched. "What covenant?" "The elders," lips quivered. "A pact as old as our people. The bearer of the mark commands the Tirakai. No warrior may raise arms against him. His word is law." The words spread like wildfire, whispered from soldier to soldier. Shock swept through the arena. Some hissed in rage, others pressed themselves flatter to the ground, as though proximity to Kale's blood might burn them alive. Kale's mind raced. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't wanted this. He only came here to fight, to stay alive, for one more day. Now the aliens who had enslaved his people for years bowed as if he were their emperor. Before he could speak again, a roar split the silence. Lord Vale, Rissa's father, stood in the upper tier. He had risen from his throne, towering above the arena in armor studded with plasma nodes that hummed with violent energy. His 4 golden eyes glared like suns about to ignite. He leapt down, the impact shaking the floor as cracks spiderwebbed outward from his boots. "Lies!" the warlord thundered. His hammer, a weapon taller than Kale, crackled with lightning arcs. "No off-worlder can bear the covenant. This is trickery, sorcery. I will shatter it." The warriors remained bowed, none daring to rise. The mark forced obedience, but Vale resisted it with sheer will. His presence radiated defiance, a mountain refusing to kneel. He turned on his daughter, his voice a storm. "Rissa, kill him. End this farce before it spreads." Rissa faltered, her blade trembling. Her entire life had been spent preparing to serve the Covenant's chosen. Yet never had she imagined that chosen one would be human. "Father, the mark is real. I can feel it binding me. It won't obey me anymore. It answers only to him." Her words struck the crowd like a spear. Gasps rose, and for the first time in centuries, Tirakai warriors looked at one another with uncertainty. Kale straightened, blood still dripping from his palm, but he forced himself to meet the warlord's gaze. His voice was low, but steady. "You're afraid, because you know they won't rise for you again." Lord Vale bared his teeth, fury etched across his scarred face. "I need no army to crush a worm. I will grind you into the dirt with my own hands." The hammer lifted, glowing with plasma so bright it blinded the closest onlookers. Each step he took forward boomed like thunder, rattling Kale's bones. Kale had no weapon, no shield, nothing but a spear of adrenaline burning in his chest. He gripped the haft of a broken Tirakai spear, lying half buried in the sand, and raised it in both hands. Crude against the warlord's weapon, but it was all he had. The crowd didn't move. They couldn't. Bound by the mark, they watched in paralyzed silence as warlord and slave prepared to clash. Rissa raised her sword between them, blocking her father's path. Her body shook, but her voice was clear. "If you strike him, you strike the covenant itself. You dishonor all our kind," Vale snarled, swinging his hammer aside, shattering stone instead of her. Sparks showered the ground, the air sizzling with ozone. Traitorous child, Kale's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no idea what the mark truly meant or how long its grip on the Tirakai would last. But one thing was certain. The warlord wasn't going to let him live another second, and the human wasn't about to bow. The duel that began as a spectacle was about to spiral into war. The sand vibrated beneath Kyle's feet as Lord Vale lunged forward. The warlord's hammer howled, a storm of plasma rippling down its length, smashing into the ground where Kyle had stood a heartbeat before. Stone exploded, spraying shards. Through the air like shrapnel, Kyle rolled, instinct honed from years of battlefield training kicking in, but this was different from fighting soldiers with rifles. This was a mountain trying to crush him with raw power. His lungs burned, his palm seared with the rune's light, yet he refused to falter. Rissa intercepted, her blade shrieking against the hammer's head. Sparks erupted as rune light met. Plasma, the clash echoing like thunder through the arena. She pushed with all her strength, her voice raw. "Father, stop!" But Vale only snarled, his armor's energy fields pulsing brighter, forcing her backward. "You will not protect him. You will not betray me." Kyle seized the opening, diving for a fallen Tirakai weapon. His fingers wrapped around a spear shaft, heavier than any human forge could craft. He lifted it awkwardly, but training steadied his grip. He spun and thrust, driving the jagged tip toward the warlord's flank. The spear glanced off the shimmering shield with a hiss. Vale backhanded him with the hammer's haft, sending Kale skidding across the sand, ribs screaming. The crowd, still kneeling under the mark's control, could only watch as their warlord bellowed like a god of destruction. Above, the sky lit up with chaos. The first wave of human resistance ships broke through the clouds, engines burning blue. Sleek frigates and starfighters dove into the Tirakai fleet, firing plasma torpedoes that streaked like comets. Explosions blossomed in the heavens, dazzling even the warriors below. Kale's chest clenched. His people were here. The fleet had come for him, but they were outnumbered. Hundreds of Tirakai warships locked into formation, their weapons tearing through the smaller human craft. From the arena floor, he could hear the distant thunder of orbital cannons, the screams of ships dying in fire. The humans were fighting against impossible odds. Every second counted. He staggered back to his feet, blood dripping down his side. Rissa's blade still held her father at bay, but only barely. Sparks rained as the hammer hammered down again and again, cracking stone beneath her boots. Kale lifted his palm, the glowing wound throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He didn't know how it worked, didn't understand the runes carved into his flesh, but something inside urged him to command. He shouted, voice raw, carrying over the arena. "Rise!" The Tirakai soldiers froze. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, like puppets yanked by strings, they raised their weapons. Spears, swords, and rifles clattered as they snapped to attention, every eye locked on Kale. Lord Vale staggered mid-swing, his massive frame trembling as though resisting invisible chains. His teeth gnashed in fury. "No, you will not command. My blood." But his army was no longer his. Kale's voice shook, but grew louder. "Fight with me, or your chains remain forever." The kneeling warriors roared, their voices merging with the sound of the battle overhead. They stood, united, no longer under Vale's command, but bound to the mark in Kale's hand. Rissa faltered, lowering her blade as she watched her own soldiers turn away from her father. Her eyes flicked to Kale, realization dawning that her world had just shifted. The warlord's fury was volcanic. He smashed his hammer into the ground, sending a shock wave that hurled soldiers backward, but they rose again, drawn by Kale's will. The covenant was no longer his. It had abandoned him. Kale tightened his grip on the spear, body trembling but spirit unyielding. Above, one of the human frigates exploded, fire raining across the clouds. He clenched his teeth. His people were dying for him, and he couldn't waste that sacrifice. He raised his glowing hand high. The light spilled outward, bright enough to blind. All across the arena, Tirakai bowed deeper, their weapons snapping into line like an army, preparing for war. For the first time, Kale understood. This was not just about survival. This was about turning the enemy's own strength against them. He looked up at the burning sky, then back at the warlord, his voice steady with defiance. "Your empire just lost its army." Vale's roar shook the stones, a sound of rage and fear. His hammer lifted again, arcs of plasma splitting the air. But now, Kyle wasn't alone. The duel had become a rebellion, and the war was only beginning. The first clash inside the citadel was not fought with blades but with silence breaking into chaos. For centuries, the Tirakai had stood as masters, their word law, their dominance absolute. Now they hesitated, weapons heavy in their claws, eyes flicking between their kneeling comrades, and the human standing defiantly with a glowing hand. Kyle's voice carried through the arena like a thunderclap. "No more slavery, no more masters. You want freedom? Take it!" The mark pulsed, brighter than before, and his command rippled outward like a shockwave. Tirakai guards at the slave pens dropped their whips. Shackles cracked as hidden mechanisms disengaged, the Covenant binding turning lock against key. The prisoners inside, humans, reptilian drudges, insectoid miners, and even towering beasts once broken into war animals, stumbled out into the light. They blinked against the suns, stunned by the impossible, their captors kneeling while a man from Earth beckoned them forward. A roar erupted. Years of buried rage ignited like a powder keg. Prisoners seized fallen weapons, snapped chains into flails, and tore armor from kneeling guards. What began as scattered cries became a tide of fury. Kyle didn't hesitate. He lifted a stolen spear, its black shaft nearly twice his height, and pointed toward the gates. "We march now. Freedom doesn't wait." The flood burst forward. Freed captives surged into the streets of the citadel, striking down the few. Tirakai, who resisted the Covenant's call. Walls that had echoed with screams of punishment now thundered with the voices of revolt. Smoke rose as forges were overrun, armories raided, and prison doors shattered. Inside the arena, Lord Vale roared, swinging his hammer in blind fury. His power cracked stone, but his own warriors could not follow him. They staggered, bound by the Covenant's grip, their eyes locked on Kale as if every instinct demanded they obey. Rissa planted herself before her father, her rune blade raised. "It's over," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her arms. "You cannot fight the Covenant." Her father spat blood and rage. "The Covenant is mine, not his." He hurled himself at her, but Kale intercepted, spear crossing the hammer's path. The collision spat fire, but Kale didn't fall. He pressed forward, his glowing palm blazing brighter, the runes etched in his flesh binding the warlord's strength. For the first time, Vale faltered. His knee dipped, the weight of the Covenant forcing him downward. He snarled, resisting with sheer fury, but Kale leaned harder, voice sharp. "Kneel!" The words struck like a blade. Vale trembled but refused. Instead, he ripped himself back, retreating toward the throne chamber, bellowing orders no one obeyed. Outside, the revolt spread to every corner of the citadel. The city's spires, once beacons of dominance, now echoed with battle cries. Fires leapt between rooftops as humans and freed species fought side by side. The human fleet above, bloodied and staggering, saw the uprising below and rallied. Dropships pierced the sky, landing reinforcements into the streets, soldiers pouring, out with rifles blazing. Cheers rose from the ground as freed prisoners joined ranks with human marines, turning the Citadel's avenues into war zones. Kale charged with them, his presence at the front like a banner made flesh. His glowing hand lit the way through smoke and ruin. Where he passed, kneeling Tirakai abandoned their posts, surrendering weapons that were instantly turned against their empire. At the gates, a massive barricade loomed, bristling with mounted cannons. Kale raised his palm, the Tirakai manning. It froze, their hands shaking as the Covenant compelled obedience. One by one, they stepped away from their posts. The cannons fell silent. The path was open. Forward! Kale roared, his voice raw but carrying over the din. The gates burst under the combined fury of humans and their allies, the tide of revolt spilling deeper into the heart of the city. Behind them, Risa walked at Kale's side, her blade lowered, but her resolve unshaken. Her gaze swept over her kin kneeling before a human. Shame burned in her eyes, but beneath it was something else. Recognition. She murmured to him as they advanced. The Covenant doesn't just bind. It reshapes loyalty. They will follow you until death. Kyle didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. His focus was fixed on the palace, where the warlord still held ground. The citadel groaned with fire and fury, the old order collapsing brick by brick. Chains had been turned into weapons. Slaves had become soldiers, and Kale, a prisoner hours before, now marched at the head of an army. The throne chamber loomed like the heart of a beast, vast and echoing, lit by crimson flames flickering in braziers of bone. Black banners hung in tatters, half burned from the fighting outside. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic stench of blood. Kale pushed through the shattered gates, spear in one hand, his other palm burning with the Covenant's mark. Behind him, a river of freed fighters surged forward, humans, insectoid allies, reptilian brutes, all carrying stolen arms, voices raised in fury. At the far end of the chamber, Lord Vale waited. His war armor was cracked from earlier battles, but the plasma cores embedded in it still glowed with lethal power. His hammer rested across his shoulder, humming with energy, his golden eyes locked on Kyle. "You think you've won?" the warlord growled, his voice carrying like thunder. "You think a trick of blood makes you master? I am Tirakai. I am war." Kale leveled his spear, standing at the front of his army. His voice was hoarse but steady. "No, you're a tyrant clinging to ashes." The warlord roared and charged. His hammer came down like a meteor. Kale braced, spear raised. Impact cracked stone, sent debris flying, shock waves rippling through the hall. He staggered back, ribs aching but didn't fall. Rissa darted in from the flank, her rune blade, cutting arcs of light. She struck her father's armor, sparks cascading where the blade bit deep, but the shields held. Vale backhanded her, sending her sprawling against a column. "Traitorous child!" he spat before swinging again at Kale. The human met him strike for strike, his glowing palm flaring brighter each time their weapons collided. The Covenant's energy surged, feeding strength into his limbs. But the warlord was a juggernaut. Every blow rattled Kyle's bones. Every clash felt like standing in the path of a collapsing starship. The freed fighters tried to intervene, hurling spears and firing looted rifles, but plasma shields shimmered around Vale, deflecting every shot. He was a fortress unto himself. The only way to end him was through the Covenant's bond. Kale realized it then. The mark wasn't just a chain of obedience, it was a weapon that cut through loyalty, through the very essence of the Tirakai. He had to use it, not just as a symbol, but as a blade sharper than steel. Vale lifted his hammer high for the killing strike. Kale dropped his spear and thrust his bleeding hand forward. The runes carved into his palm exploded with light, brighter than the braziers, brighter than the suns outside. The chamber shook. The Covenant surged outward, chains of fire snaking across the floor and up the walls, latching on to every Tirakai present. They convulsed, forced lower to the ground as if gravity itself had multiplied tenfold. The warlord snarled, his body trembling, knees buckling. He fought the pull with every ounce of his monstrous strength, muscles bulging, armor screaming as it resisted. "I will not kneel!" But the Covenant didn't care. It dragged him down inch by inch. His hammer fell from his grip, crashing to the floor with a sound like thunder dying. Kale advanced, step by step, the glow of his palm burning hotter. He seized a discarded spear from one of the kneeling guards, the point gleaming in the light. His voice rang through the chamber. "You ruled with chains. You fed on fear. Now you kneel." The word hit like a hammer. Vale roared, his knees slamming into the stone, his body forced into submission at last. His golden eyes blazed with hatred. But the Covenant left him powerless, bowed before the very human he had once called prey. Kyle raised the spear high, then drove it through the warlord's chest. The crack of armor shattering echoed like the breaking of the old world. Vale's roar turned to a gasp, then silence. The warlord slumped forward, the light fading from his eyes, his body collapsing under the weight of defeat. For a moment, no one moved. The throne chamber was still, save for the crackle of dying flames. Then the sound spread, a ripple, a roar. Tyrakai warriors beat their weapons against the ground, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. Freed allies raised their voices in triumph. The tyrant of the citadel was dead. Kale pulled the spear free, chest heaving, sweat and blood mingling on his skin. He turned toward the gathered masses, lifting his glowing palm high. "No more thrones, no more chains. Today we fight for freedom, and we win." The chamber erupted in cheers, a sound that shook the citadel to its foundations. The fall of Lord. Vale wasn't just the end of a ruler. It was the death knell of an empire. The citadel's spires burned against the sky. Smoke coiled upward, carrying the scent of victory and ruin alike. The thunder of battle had ebbed into the clamor of rebuilding, voices shouting, chains clattering as they were piled into heaps, and the steady tramp of countless freed feet moving with purpose. Kale stood at the balcony of the throne chamber, the dead warlord's seat behind him. The Covenant still glowed faintly on his palm, its runes etched into his flesh like fire trapped under skin. Below, an ocean of beings gathered. Humans in battered armor, insectoid miners wielding scavenged rifles, scaled giants scarred from generations of servitude. All eyes turned to him. He raised his hand, and silence rippled outward. The mark pulsed, once bright as lightning, binding their attention without force, only through recognition. "Today," Kale said, voice carrying across the square, "chains shattered. Today the warlord fell. But this victory is not mine. It is ours. No human, no Tyrakai, no alien stands above the other. We fight as one, or we fall as prey again." The crowd roared, not as slaves, not as scattered tribes, but as a single, rising voice. Rissa stepped beside him, armor scorched, her blade still stained. Her expression was hard, but her eyes softened when they met his. "You've done what no one thought possible. My people bow to you. The question is, what will you do with them?" Kale looked down at his hand. The Covenant still hummed, alive, with power. He knew it could bend entire species to his will, could forge an empire greater than Vale's ever was, but he also knew what that road would make of him. His jaw clenched. Not an empire, a brotherhood. Outside the citadel, human fleet ships descended through the haze, their steel hulls reflecting the flames below. Marines deployed in formation, but when they saw the swelling tide of allies, beings they had once only pitied from afar, they lowered their rifles. For the first time, humanity didn't stand apart. It stood at the center of something larger. Word spread fast. Across the system, news of Vale's death traveled on stolen comms, through captured channels, whispered by fleeing guards. Worlds groaned under the weight of rebellion rising. Garrisons crumbled as Tirakai troops found themselves unable to resist the Covenant's pull. Old banners burned, new ones unfurled, scraps of cloth painted with crude emblems of unity carried proudly where once only fear reigned. But with victory came scars. Kyle walked through the ruined streets where bodies of rebels and loyalists lay tangled. He saw mothers clutching sons who hadn't lived to see freedom, warriors gasping their last with chains still wrapped around their wrists. He felt every loss carved deeper into him. Freedom had a cost, and it demanded more than speeches. That night, beneath the shattered sky dome of the Citadel, leaders of a dozen species gathered. Some were chieftains, others prisoners turned commanders, others survivors who had nothing, but their will to speak for them. They sat in a circle, the fires crackling between them. Kale remained standing. "We are bound by this," he said, lifting his palm. "It gives me power none of us asked for. But I swear before you, I will never wield it as a master. This mark will be a shield, not a chain. When the next warlord rises, and one will, I will use it to break them. Until then, we govern together." Murmurs spread, then nods. One by one, they struck their weapons to the ground in agreement. A covenant of their own was born, not etched into flesh, but into choice. Rissa, seated among them, studied Kale with eyes shadowed by both loyalty and unease. "You've turned my people's bond into your weapon," she said softly when the council ended. "But you've also freed them. You are walking a blade's edge, human. Pray you never fall." Kale exhaled, staring at the stars through the broken dome. "If I fall, someone else will rise. That's the point." The galaxy beyond still smoldered with war. Tirakai fleets not yet broken would come. Other empires, watching the rise of a new alliance, would see threat instead of hope. Kale knew the battles weren't over. They had only begun. But as he looked at the sea of freed people raising torches, chanting together in defiance of the old order, he felt something stronger than fear. Not empire, not domination, but unity, forged in blood and fire. When dawn broke, it painted the Citadel ruins gold. The first banners of the new alliance rose where the warlord's insignia once flew, and Kale, with a scarred hand still burning faintly, turned from the throne room and stepped into the crowd, not as a conqueror but as the first among equals. The age of chains had ended. The age of humanity's fire had begun.